just another story of the same. You know, we're having a good time. Just be respectful, dudes, and never learn.
Okay. Hi, and welcome to the Baltimore Bureau podcast at the Real News Network. My name's Tharna Noor, as always, and I'm here with Easy Jackson.
Bonjour.
Hello.
We are missing Baynard Woods this week. Shout out to Baynard. I hope he's getting plenty of the much-needed rest. Baynard's been going hard, working a lot lately, so much love to him. We'll have him back in here next week.
We endorse this break.
Yes, definitely.
So today, the day that we're recording is Friday, April 27th, which means that it's been 3 years since some of the biggest protests during the Baltimore uprising after Freddie Gray was killed in police custody. So actually in our first piece, we'll take a look back at, the uprising and the movement since then, the movements before then. This is an interview with from the Mark Steiner show that Mark Steiner did with Eddie Conway, who's an executive producer here, and DeRay Smith, who is the vice president of Tubman House, an activist in Baltimore. You'll hear them talk about movements from 1968, when there were big protests in Baltimore, to 2018, to today, and in light of this conference that Hopkins is doing on Monday about movements and the social determinants of health.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's get right into it.
Welcome to the Mark Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. The Johns Hopkins Urban Health Institute is holding their annual symposium on the social determinants of health. This year it's happening on April the 30th. The theme this year is 1968 to 2018, Voices of Social Change, Empower Communities for Health and Social Justice. And I'll be moderating a panel there on the Poor People's Campaign, but I'm here now with Eddie Conway and DeRay Smith, who'll be speaking at the symposium as well. And welcome, good to have you both here.
Thanks for having me.
And as way of introduction, Eddie Conway, of course, a former Black Panther, who spent 44 years in the Maryland State prisons because of America's war on activists, and black activists in particular, in the 1960s. He is now executive producer here at the Real News Network, as well as being an author of several books. And we're also here with DeRay Smith. DeRay Smith is a Baltimorean, a Navy veteran, an activist, vice president of the Tubman House, a community activist group here in the city of Baltimore, and one of our leading activists who loves his community and wants to see it change for the better. So good to have you both here on the Mark Steiner Show. So the theme of this conference, and the theme of your panel in particular, is 1968 and 2018. And let me jump with you, Eddie, first. Thinking about where we were in 1968, where we are in 2018. There's been a lot of talk about these 50 years and what they have and have not changed in society, and how it's changed the very nature of the struggle in America. I mean, how would you bring that analysis forward?
Well, I have to step back for 1 minute and just say this. I was very active in 1968, and in fact, the conditions were so bad that I felt it was important to join the Black Panther Party, which was a risky proposition in itself, right?
You out of the service then?
I was out of the service. I came home from the service to try to see what I could do to help deal with the conditions, right? But I must say now, in 2018, when I got out of jail in 2014, I was shocked. Shocked in the sense of how bad things had deteriorated. If it was bad then when I joined the Panthers, it's 10 times worse now. The city looks like it's been in a war in those 50 years. And it looks like a war zone. And so young people today, and as well as old, because it's still part of the city, have a tremendous job to do just to even bring it back to 68.
So how do you think that changes things, DeRay? I mean, you grew up in the city, went off to the Navy, came back. So Eddie comes out of prison and sees neighborhoods that were once full of people, and people in all those houses, and community built around it, no matter what people were poor and struggling economically and around racism and more, but come out and see the devastation that so many young people live with them. So how do you think that changes the nature of the struggle and what you have to do today?
I'm not sure if it necessarily does. Like you were saying, I was just away from home for maybe 4 years, and a lot of, so while I wasn't here for the uprising, but I watched it on CNN.
You were in the Navy then?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I watched it on CNN, around all my fellow, I guess, shipmates. And, I guess what was interesting to me is to hear, their thoughts on things, and I'm just sort of sitting back. And oddly enough, I read Eddie's book, and I was like, I gotta get out of the Navy. I'm not helping anybody by being here. So, I sort of had that same idea. It's like, I need to go home and do something. But I'm not sure if much has changed other than the tools we have, I guess, as activists now. But as far as the conditions, I don't know. I mean, we still have the same struggle, so I'm not really sure if I can say that much has changed in that way.
So I'm curious, I'm going to take a short step backwards here, because you were just talking about your experience in the Navy. You talked earlier with me in other places about your experience in the United States Army when you were there in the late 60s. So I'm curious about two things. I mean, when you talk about you watched the Freddie Gray rebellion happen here in Baltimore on TV on the ship, what was the reaction of the people you were with?
I watched it on CNN, and I just sat around, and, as far as the military thing, you gotta, hold it down and not necessarily be too out there and too radical. And, people are like, look at these idiots tearing up their home. Like, these have to be the dumbest people I've ever seen. They're destroying a terrible place that they already lived in. Like, what do they not want better for themselves? I'm just like, you don't get it. You don't get it. So, yeah, I sort of felt like these are not my people. I need to go be with my people.
Does that sound familiar or different?
Yeah, it's exactly the same with me. I didn't try to hold it down. In fact, I think I probably lost it because when I looked at the Stars and Stripes, which was the Army paper that was over in Europe, and I seen on the front, I seen that tank in the black community with a 50 caliber machine gun pointed at those black women. I lost it. I said, what the devil am I doing? I'm getting ready to go to Vietnam, and I'm a sergeant in the Army at the time, and I'm ready to sign up for 3 more years. And I said, no, something's wrong. I'm getting out of here. And I actually went out on the parade field looking for my friends with the paper and asked them, did y'all see this? And so I was that was the last straw for me. And I had decided then that, okay, no more Army, no more military, because I'm not going to go somewhere and kill somebody to make the world safe for democracy when the world wasn't safe for democracy right here in our own country, right? But there was the general consensus in the Army, because the Army is a white institutional racist operation, that black people were rebelling for no reason whatsoever, and they got the best conditions and the best life that they could ever expect, and what's wrong with them, They wouldn't say that around me or black soldiers, because we were probably fed up anyway at that time. Just for doing Vietnam, we were losing a lot of our brothers.
Right.
And we were starting to figure out that we were being used as cannon fodder, So there was a lot of anger there anyway.
So let's take it to where we are now in 2018, and reflect a bit again on 1968. So one of the things I know that happened in '68, besides the demonstration and the fighting in the streets that did happen, especially in the student sector, was a lot of organizing was going on. Institutions, counter-institutions were being built, whether it was free medical clinics, breakfast programs, food co-ops and grocery stores, and other counter-institutions were being built to serve the people and to build a movement. So how does that play in today? I mean, because part of it was, people think the '60s is in the streets, demonstrations, police attacking, all that was real and was a big part of what happened. But it also was about the organizing that took place, right, in the community itself. So talk about how you see that taking place in our communities now in terms of organizing and how that's going, and how that reflects on back, Eddie, for you in terms of how it was in '68 and what you see in 2018. But how do you talk about the organizing looks like today in 2018?
Well, a lot of it is online.
Online, you said?
Yeah, a lot of it is online, I guess. But as far as organizing, I think you know, I can't say that there's like tanks in the street, but it's more of a like systemic thing, and it seems like people are focusing more on like systems and not necessarily, you know, may not necessarily be you know, I'm not gonna say there are no cops that are out, you know, so let me not even say that, but it seems like the focus has shifted a little from that to more like, wait a minute, let's look at the actual systems. So it seems like people are fighting more against the systems than like physical enemies, I guess. But like I said, there's a lot of online. It seems like everybody's an activist
like
online.
were you working in the projects around Tubman House,
Correct.
right? Tubman House is here in Baltimore. It was a house that was seized by community members and turned into a meeting place and a place of safety. Gardens were built. It was right on the corner where Freddie Gray was arrested. So, I mean, what form does that take as you do your work? Is it, I mean, is it like not going door to door, organizing around specific issues, rent or whatever that is? I mean, housing conditions, what form does it take for you?
Well, a lot of it is working with young people, you know, just teaching young people about the history and culture of movements and things like that. And growing food, another very important piece of it, growing food happens at the Tubman House. You know, and that sort of puts in people's minds that, you know, we have power and, you know, food is, it's energy, it's power, you need it to live. So just growing food is a big piece of showing people that, you know, we have all the tools we need to sustain ourselves.
I want to come back to this growing food thing, because I think this is it's a highly overlooked part of organizing all over this country, and come back to that in a second, because I think it's really important. But how does that reflect on what you remember? Not that you're out of it now, because you're in Tubman House as well and organizing down there too.
Yeah, and the tanks are there, the helicopters are there, the weapons are there. They're only brought out when necessary, but that's been the case all the time. They've always been there, and they're still there in the background now. I guess the challenge to young people is to build things, institutions. What I find is that a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement is about reaction, protests. It's similar to the civil rights era demonstrations, pleading for moral persuasion to change something. Don't shoot, hands up. You know, I'm human, these kind of things, and I'll make you uncomfortable, but I'm not gonna really force any kind of real change. I think you don't get change until you push back further, and you can't have somebody see you as human. Excuse me, you have to see yourself as human and demand that other people treat you like that, and you can't ask them to do that. And I think that's part of what the difference is now. Back in the civil rights era, that's what was going on, but that didn't get any satisfaction. That's why stronger demands were made, and people had to push back and people had to defend themselves. And I think today, stronger demands probably will have to be made, and people will have to protect their food sources and protect the things that they build at some point, because the people you're pleading to have morality has no morality.
So this is a really interesting point you just raised here. I'm just curious, really, DeRay, how you reflect on this, and then really kind of get into this for a moment, is that we don't know what form today's movement young people are going to take. I mean, in the early 60s, we didn't know what form it was going to take either, when we were beginning just to wanting to end segregation, not just wanting to, but ending segregation and being in the civil rights movement, then the anti-war movement, then organizing. And it kind of, after the assassinations of '68, especially King and Kennedy's assassination, the movement seemed to change and everything shifted. The government came down really hard and started coming after the Panthers and other groups in this country, putting people in jail, as Eddie knows all too well. And so that began to happen. So we don't know what twists and turns will necessarily happen. So I'm curious where you think the movement today is going. I mean, what's your vision, individually, collectively, about what you want to see, what world you want to see built?
That's such a tough question to answer, but...
It is a tough one. I'm sorry, so I know it's not easy, but just...
But I don't know, I suppose, like, you know, Eddie was saying, you see that some things didn't work. You know, some things clearly don't work. You have to know you gotta know who you're up against. So I think that, you know, us young folks, we could really take a step back and learn about the history of movements and activism. If we could spend more time doing that, that would be great, you know? But I guess what I would like to see is, it's hard to say because there's so many different parts of activism and so many different ways to organize. And I like to say that we need them all, but I mean, we could have less rallies and have more people growing food, or, you know, doing direct action as opposed to, you know, asking and getting people to sign papers. It's all necessary, but maybe we could shift some of those energies. That would be great to see.
Yeah. I mean, because I think we are seeing demonstrations around the country. They need to happen, given what's happening. And every week there seems to be a new story about someone else who has been abused by the police not in the city, but all over not just in the city, but all over the country, right? And that's all too real. The waffle shops, and it's just horrendously horrible things that are happening. So we have to respond to that. But to really make that change, to make it like what we're pushing and fighting for. I mean, so how do you see the difference? You see the similarities in what people were saying in '68 and what they're saying in 2018, and what we're facing and what the strategies should be?
Well, and DeRay made a good point about the things that didn't work. The government did come down hard on movements. And one of the reasons the government came down hard on movements was because the movement itself was building institutions, were building alternative relationships in the community, building ways in which the people in the community could empower themselves. That's always a frightening proposition. It's going to be a frightening proposition in the future, but people will have to build alternatives to the conditions they find themselves in. They're going to have to figure out how to feed themselves. They're going to have to figure out how to get health care. They're going to have to figure out how to control what's being taught in their schools. People have to do that. And the government's going to probably come down hard on them again. But you don't really have an alternative. And the alternative that the government presented to us was unemployment, mass incarceration, and drug the entire population. That's certainly not a future that we want our children to go into, especially with the planet being in peril right now.
So I'm wondering what role you think electoral politics plays in all this. And I asked that question for a specific reason. That was a debate back in the late '60s. Do we get involved in electoral politics? Do we stay in the street? And then you've seen this last election in Baltimore City, where we're broadcasting from, where a lot of young progressive council people were elected, black and white, men and women. And then you saw the recent vote in Annapolis, where the majority of both white liberal Democrats and the majority, a good number of the Black Caucus members, voted for this crime bill, which is similar to a crime bill that the 1994 omnibus bill under Clinton, that will lead to more people going to jail rather than getting to the root of why this is happening, to help people build a new society and a new community. So what role does that play for you right now in electoral politics? How important is that? Is that do you think, part of the strategy? Is there a split around that? Well, how do you see that playing out?
I mean, it's clearly a part of the strategy. It's a part of, you know, the overarching system that we all fall under. But it's not my place. It's not where I plan to focus my energies. We got people on that, but that's a tough one. That's a really tough one because a lot of people are putting their faith and hope and everything into these politicians. Like, they're just people. They're just people, and so I guess I spend less energy really focusing on those people.
Eddie?
Yeah, I do believe you should engage in the local politics. We should try to gain control of our communities, the municipalities, etc. I think that's an important piece, but I think we always have to recognize that the people that control the politics in America are the people that control the wealth in America. And even though we can put the numbers out there on the ground at some point, we still have to recognize who the power comes from the wealth. And the wealth controls the means of production and so on. So we have to recognize that. And until we build alternative sources of power, the politics is always going to be up for sale.
So just one last thing. These are not easy questions I'm throwing out, I know, but I mean things that I ponder and think about a lot. So how do you both think then a movement gets built that is actually a movement that has some substance and broad reach that reaches a lot of people to make that change? Because I mean that there can be a few people who spearhead it, but unless there's a mass of people behind that spear, then it doesn't go anywhere. It can get crushed. So how do you see this playing out?
I guess it's like a snowball sort of thing. I'm upset about a thing. I write about it on Facebook, and a couple more people are upset about it too. But yeah, it seems like it's happening around like an event will happen, or some tragic thing will happen. But that's what people are doing, reacting to these things. But as far as building a stronger movement, it's tough. It's very tough because things sort of seem to just die out. Like people have short attention spans. So I think that when you find that solid group of people, you rock with them, whether it's 2 or 20, you'll get there.
I think you build a movement by building institutions. You build things like Tubman House. You build things like the water protectors. You build people that's opposed to the incinerator. You build movements by engaging in either stopping stuff or building stuff. And I think those groups will eventually connect and network together. A similar thing happened in France in 1799 or something like that. It was like 10,000 little groups. There was no mass movement. People wanted bread. People were hungry. People were being abused. People had all kinds of things that they were agitated about, but they organized in their little circles. But eventually, those little circles networked. Something lit it, and it sparked. And all of those different groups came together, whether they was concerned about gender rights or whether they were concerned about slavery or whatever it was that they was concerned about at that time. They came together with that spark.
And on that note, thank you, Eddie Conway and DeRay Smith. Good to have you both with us here on the Mark Steiner Show on the Real News Network. And folks, this Monday will be the conference taking place at Johns Hopkins on social change, empower communities for health and social justice, 1968 to 2018, that we will all be part of. And Eddie and DeRay are also, let me just say, both part of Tubman House here in Baltimore. And I'm Mark Steiner for the Real News Network and the Mark Steiner Show. Thank you for being with us.
All right, you just heard a piece from Mark Steiner. We're welcoming Mark Steiner on board. It's good having him here. This next piece is one that I did. I'm excited about. There's a roller skating rink here in Baltimore called Shake and Bake. It's over on the west side, not far from Sandtown, which is the neighborhood that Freddie Gray was killed in. We actually mentioned the riots happening around there, but Shake and Bake is like a staple here in Baltimore. Roller skating is a subculture that I think a lot of people participate in, but you don't really hear much about. And Shake and Bake recently went through a renovation period, but one of the interesting things is like how well, it's a family fun center. So there's a roller skating rink, but then there's also a bowling alley. There's a Billie Holiday room where you can rent and have birthday parties and baby showers and stuff. But the building was opened by Glenn Doughty, who was a Baltimore Colts player. So I think this is a really interesting story we did. It got me really excited about roller skating again. To be honest, me and Will Arenas went down to the adults only skate night, which happens on Thursdays.
Adults only skate night.
Yeah. And they were very adamant at the door about like being 30 and over. Like I saw them actually like turn a few teenagers or younger looking people away. Like, it's adults only tonight.
I'm going to get a fake ID that says I'm 31 so I can go to adult skate night.
The crazy thing about being there was like thinking about growing up and like not being allowed to go to adult night, like seeing like, you know, your older cousins and aunts and stuff go to Shake and Bake on Thursday nights, and like actually now standing there, it was cool. But I think this is a great piece.
Yeah, and we should say like these are all video pieces also. So particularly this one, but all of them. The last one on the Mark Steiner show that I produced, this one that Easy and Will did, and then all of the pieces you're going to hear today. You should head over to therealnews.com and watch the videos too, because they have lovely camera work, and this one particularly you get to see like really dope footage of people skating and stuff in Shake and Bake. So
just check it out. The roller skating rink is one of the places where African Americans have adapted bland American pastimes into vital subcultures that enable people to express their individuality together.
And we were the ones. This year, we was taking skate war.
People from all over the world enjoy what is called artistic roller skating. But Baltimore, sometimes called Snap City, has its own flair. Because of the personalities drawn to the center, Shake and Bake is more than just a roller skating rink. After closing down for repairs in August of 2017, it recently reopened and continues to be a staple in Baltimore and the roller skating community beyond, the way it's been for decades.
Shake and Bake was the mecca of skating on the East Coast. People came from D.C., Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, every night, Virginia, just to skate at Shake and Bake. Well, it's great because you have everybody from school teachers to janitors, doctors, you got Princeton men, you got Harvard men, you got Tuskegee men, Howard men. So you have an influx of good people coming into the community so the kids just don't see all the poverty and you know, the corruption in the community. So we bring that to the community as well.
Shake and Bake as a whole, to the people that have been skating for a long time, it's a culture. We skate religiously. We're very loyal to Shake and Bake. We come here, we show it, we spread love. We're like, it's like a big family. Everybody knows everyone's name. And when it closed down, it was a sadness. And now that it's opened back up, if you look out on the floor, everyone's happy, smiling, enjoying the music's good. So we love the Bake. I appreciate it being open, really do.
Shake and Bake Family Fun Center sits on the historic Pennsylvania Avenue, once known as a popular black entertainment hub where businesses thrived and black performers could showcase their talent without Jim Crow segregation. The center holds both a roller skating rink and a bowling alley. A room in the front of the building is named after Billie Holiday.
The environment, man, is soulful, man. It's Baltimore City right here. This is the liveness of it. Man, you just see people just doing back in the day with that little skate. Man, hey, I'm getting jealous on some of the ones who know how to flip around. I want to trip one of them, but I ain't gonna do it, you know what I mean? It's all love, it's all love.
Oh my God, so many memories when I came in today because I haven't been here in years. So I just imagine like all the guys doing all the tricks, coming around the ring. So it just brought back memories because I haven't been here in years.
Shake and Bake was originally started by NFL star and Baltimore Colts wide receiver Glenn Shake and Bake Doughty in 1982. Doughty was a popular, charismatic star who even penned a song after himself, using a band made up entirely of Baltimore Colts players. The Family Fun Center was the first of its kind with over 70,000 square feet. Doughty secured over $5.2 million in funding. At the recent reopening, Doughty took shots at present-day athletes like Colin Kaepernick and their protests of police shooting unarmed black men, saying that instead of protesting, he opened the building for the community.
About athletes who were protesting, we wasn't protesting in 1982, we were building this. Because we didn't just talk, we got it done.
But when Shake and Bake first opened, world-famous boxing champion Muhammad Ali was there. At the same time, he was the controversial athletic figure because of his stance against racism and the Vietnam War and his conversion to Islam. But building for the community is hard, especially to sustain. Only 3 years after opening Shake and Bake, Doughty struggled financially and had trouble making loan payments, so he sold it to the city of Baltimore. The city has owned the building since 1985 and installed Anthony Williams Sr. as its operator and manager, where he remained for almost 3 decades until the recent closure forced him out.
When I shut it down, you'd have thought I shut down heaven.
But all politics aside, people from the community want this building to stay and thrive.
I actually formed the Save the Shake and Bake Association. I'm the president of the National Association of Black Colleges and Universities. So if they didn't follow through, we were going to make sure they followed through, because this is a vital institution for the community.
Well, I've been skating a long time. I mean, back, I guess, since I was in the 12th grade at Carver High School, Carver Vocational Technical High School. So I've been coming down to Bake for a while.
For many, roller skating is a therapeutic release, a fun physical activity. It is dancing on wheels, but it is often a community, a safe space, a reunion. In the 80s and 90s, when West Baltimore, like many urban areas, was facing the crack epidemic, Shake and Bake was a place for young people to escape. In 2015, it was near the heart of the uprising following the death of Freddie Gray. In 2016, when acclaimed Baltimore rapper Lil Scooter was murdered, people young and old blocked off Pennsylvania Avenue, where he grew up, to celebrate his life.
Lil Scooter, baby, keep them bitches going crazy.
Where did they gather? You guessed it, right in front of Shake and Bake. The city of Baltimore invested nearly $300,000 into reopening Shake and Bake. The brand new floors, lights, roof, kitchen, and heating system were all essential renovations. For many of the old-timers, the new Shake and Bake is not perfect. People complain about the branding of The Bake. But in a neighborhood in serious need of resources, Shake and Bake represents the relationship that can exist between the community, government, and those who have a love for shaking, baking, and roller skating. For the Real News Network, with Will Arenas, I'm Easy Jackson.
All right, Easy. We just heard from you about Shake and Bake on Pennsylvania Avenue here in Baltimore.
Yeah.
Our next piece is one from Taya Graham about sexual harassment in Annapolis. It's the first of a 4-part series, so keep an eye out on the site for the rest of them. This is kind of a hard to listen to piece, hard to listen to, hard to watch, because, you know, it sheds so much light on just the fucked upness of, you know, rape culture and sexual assault in the capital of Maryland, where, you know, the session just wrapped up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's important that we continue having these conversations. I mean, we're sitting here today. Yesterday, Bill Cosby was found guilty on all charges.
Yeah.
I think in all aspects of our environment, we got to look at, you know, this culture where men in power can just, you know, harass and assault women. And then just get away with it. You know, in politics, we know there's a lot of power and money in politics. And this stuff has been going on for years, but finally, you know, a lot of it is starting to come to light. And I'm glad Taya Graham did this piece.
Yeah, and it's crazy. Like we were talking yesterday about how, you know, like Bill Cosby has been found guilty on all charges. And Bill Cosby is, like, in many ways not at all a sympathetic figure. But then also yesterday, like, Khalees came out and said that Nas was abusing her through their whole relationship. And it's like, I don't know, it's interesting to see people grappling with, like, you know, this amazing artist like Nas, who's been, like, there's such a, like, force of education and, like, radicalizing people and everything. So, yeah, it's, I think, a time of reckoning for lots of people. And this is
definitely
a really important aspect of that.
Yeah, so let's check it out.
Some may not know this, but #MeToo was started by a black woman. This movement to encourage women to come forward and identify sexual harassers was founded by civil rights activist Tarana Burke 10 years ago, before it became a social media hashtag. But black women have been instrumental in bringing sexual harassment to the forefront. #MeToo began even earlier with Michelle Vincent, a black woman who in 1986 won a landmark Supreme Court case against the bank manager who had sexually assaulted her, and the bank Meritor Savings systems that did nothing to protect her. Me Too has inspired women across the country and in every walk of life to call out their abusers, whether it's Olympic gold-winning medalist Michaela Maroney to award-winning actress Selma Hayek. And now the Me Too movement has made a stand at our state capitol. Women who have worked for the state government in Annapolis have come forward and made allegations of sexual harassment with the support of the organization Not Without Black Women. My guests are Brittany Oliver, a women's rights activist and director of the social justice organization Not Without Black Women, Delegate Angela Angel, and Nina Smith, a communications consultant and former Annapolis staffer. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Now, Brittany, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, African American women experience sexual harassment and sexual violence at a 35% higher rate than their white counterparts. And this number goes up if the woman is poor or transgendered or suffers from mental illness. How is the Me Too movement dealing with these kind of disparities?
So I think with the Me Too movement, it started, from what it looks like, it started in Hollywood, right? Where there were women in Hollywood who were experiencing issues with sexual abuse and sexual harassment. And so I think what Me Too nationally has done is it's giving local communities an opportunity to have further discussions about the disparities that are taking place. While the issue at hand is not new, because there are women and advocates and activists who have been talking about this issue for a really long time. And so I think what's happening right now is that this is a time where women are saying enough is enough. And so now it's starting to hit close to home.
Could you describe what rape culture is and how it affects women?
So rape culture is it's basically a term that puts experiences, brings the women's experiences to life about what they experience on sometimes a day-to-day basis, whether it be at home, whether it's at work, maybe in the street, in public space. But rape culture is a system where sexual abuse and harassment, so inappropriate touching, sexual comments, groping, any sort of sexual unwanted behavior that women face on a daily basis. And so what makes it a culture is that there are people who are complacent within the system. And so so being silent about it and not speaking up for women and other types, because survivors there are all types of survivors, but specifically this issue impacts women, especially Black women. And so what makes it a culture is that it's ingrained, it's embedded into our systems. It perpetuates structural and institutionalized sexism, and which prohibits women from being able to have a place to report the abuse and harassment that they're facing. So it's the same thing as any other form of oppression that we're resisting. I think that Me Too has provided an opportunity to have more of these conversations.
Do you think there are special issues that Black women face when addressing rape culture? I know from my experience that Black women often feel they have to remain silent in order to protect Black men, to make sure they're not put into an unjust criminal justice system. Do you see any differences in the way Black women have to approach this?
Definitely. As a Black woman myself, I think that, so I've been working on issues surrounding around rape culture for a long time. I think that it's in my own experience, it's different now because I'm addressing my own people, I'm addressing Black people. And so the stakes are high, right? Black women's issues are very intersectional. We deal with not only race issues, but also gender and ageism and intersectionality, the term that was coined. I think at this point, Black women advocating on these issues is a risk. The term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And so Black women's issues are very intersectional. We deal with race, class, gender, ageism, a number of issues. These issues for us are not siloed. Our identities matter a great deal in how the world treats us. And so when we're talking about rape culture, in particular with Black women, I personally feel like it's for myself and other Black women I know that this is a risk. Black women talking about issues surrounding rape culture is a risk.
Right.
If I could, I'll also add that, that risk and that kind of pressure point, I think, is also forcing us to speak up, right? Unfortunately, white women kind of opened up this conversation on a popular level, right? And though we've been advocating per usual on these issues, they expanded that platform and they opened up more opportunities at an acceptable level, unfortunately. And I think that's what is so distinct and powerful about this movement and what's kind of happened, right? It's reinforced the fact that we still have a lot of ingrained stereotypes and bias towards women of color, particularly Black women. We're not listening to them, we're not believing them, right? And so I think we're recognizing, even in the Black Lives Matter movement, and you're kind of seeing women at the forefront of that movement, that, and having Tarana Burke actually uplifted and people acknowledging that she started this has been really, really important, because that risk, us being exposed. Anita Hill before tried this and it did not work. She was vilified. I think now we feel there's a little bit more safety, though there is still the Black backlash that comes with it. I mean, even in our advocacy in Maryland, we faced a little bit of backlash because we weren't naming names. And for us, even naming names would so detract, because we're usually not believed. They usually won't listen to us, and they focus more on our history rather than the behavior itself and what it's doing to impact the people involved. And so it's just, I think now is the moment where we feel like actually we can kind of strike that balance and lean in and see what we can do to make some real strategic gains.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up Anita Hill, because in 1991 she made very credible allegations, and then a nominee for the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, and even he became a Supreme Court justice. So are you concerned at all that the Me Too movement is going to have that kind of setback, that kind of very public, very hurtful kind of setback?
I mean, I think folks experience those setbacks every day when they're encountering this behavior. What I think is important is, and for me, the reason why I came forward was this real issue around consent and respect. And, the fact that we refuse, I don't know why as a society that we haven't really had these conversations before. I remember when Anita Hill testified, and I remember the reactions to her. And it's ingrained in my memory, and I was only 10 years old at the time, Those issues and the way we're perceived, again, factors so much into this conversation, particularly, again, around consent, because, it's about basic respect. And a lot of times, I think it was Malcolm X who said the Black woman in America is one of the most disrespected.
Right, absolutely. And look how little has changed. Black women aren't often considered credible witnesses. Yes. I know in the case of Daniel Holtzclaw, who was a police officer who targeted poor African-American women for his sexual assaults because he knew they wouldn't be considered credible witnesses. So unfortunately, that is just as true today as it was when he said it so many years ago. Delegate Angel, let me ask you a question. How do you think Me Too is different for Black women?
I think it's like both Brittany and Nina said. For Black women, we have to balance a lot of different things, and it's not just about intersectionality. It's about who we are. For us, when we speak out against some of the things that have happened to us, we risk not only not being believed, but we also have to balance whether or not in us speaking out and not being believed, we take into consideration, does it dilute the movement? Does it dilute progress? Because I think a lot of Black women, when we do things, we think of it communally. That's one of the reasons why, movements live and die by what we do, because that's how we move. I think there's also a factor of, we also balance, when we speak out against someone who has harmed us or who's doing these behaviors, when they are a man of importance, right? When they are doing some good things, what the blowback will be on us, because it will be said, oh, this particular person, this man was going places, he was doing things for the community, and you brought him down. So as Black women, we balance the fact of, okay, if a powerful man has done something against us, we take into consideration the fact that if we speak out against him, if we actually do name them, what many in the community will turn and say is that you've brought down this man who was helping us. When things started to happen in Annapolis and people, there was very widely known a letter. I didn't sign on to it. And the letter, when people were were talking about it, they said, well, we want to make sure that people know that we're doing good work here. And I thought that was, one of the most asinine statements, because, when you look at Harvey Weinstein, right? Harvey Weinstein made amazing movies, right? He's responsible for some of the best pictures in the past 2 decades.
Absolutely.
And he was a monster, and he was a predator. One doesn't make the other one not possible.
Right.
It can be possible that, and that's what I said, it's very possible, and in fact a reality. We do great work in Annapolis. We change bills, we change lives, we do great legislation. We also have predators there. Right. We have men that prey on staff and fellow legislators, and that they are known and they are not stopped. And we have women there that enable them and that cover their crimes. And it doesn't mean that we don't still have and do good work. And in some of the cases, it doesn't mean that even some of those men are responsible for doing still good legislation, because people are multifaceted.
Right.
And so one of the things I think also as Black women, we always take that into consideration because we're community minded. When people have asked, us, and as Nina said, about naming people, one of the things that we have blowback, and we know, and that's even been said to me, is that, well, you have to think about also the good that's being done, and that's hard, and that's a burden that we carry. I've been in many spaces where I'm the only Black woman, and I've also been now representing Prince George's County in a space where it's a majority Black county. Honestly, there are times when it feels safer in a space where I am more of a true minority, because then, one, people are more cautious, and there are also more safeguards. In a lot of the cases, when you find when people of power are targeting women, or when they're doing things to women, you'll find they're often doing it to women that are least protected when they're doing it. So if you have a Black person in power, they're targeting a Black woman, and they'll be completely different with some of the white women that are around them.
That's disturbing.
Because they know that there's a certain level of protection that those white women carry. So when some of my legislators said, oh, I've never experienced this in Annapolis, I was thinking, well, there's a lot of reasons why you've never experienced this. But there was also some times when I had to say, the fact that you said you've never seen it, that's a lie. Because I've been in rooms where this has happened to me, and you've been there, and you've looked away, or you've just kind of acted as if you didn't see it. Don't tell me you've never seen this behavior, because that is a lie.
Wow. If it's okay, I'd like to follow up with asking you about your own experience with sexual harassment in Annapolis, if you don't mind sharing.
Sure. And some of it's come out. I mean, and I'll be honest, I think Nina and Brittany talked about it. It's not a safe space to really even fully speak about. I've received backlash from even, from speaking about it to what I have. I've received backlash from standing up for myself and saying, if you do this again, I am going to let the world know. And if you do this again, if you allow it to be done, I'm going to report you. And I've received serious backlash over even taking that statement. And in Annapolis, backlash can be something as simple as, oh, well, now none of your bills are passing, right? And people will say,
that's huge.
Right.
That's huge. That's interfering with your ability to get your job done and to serve your constituents.
Exactly. But it's done in such a way, Annapolis can be manipulated in such a way where it can be very under the cover. It can be, oh, well, we just didn't think it was a good bill. Oh, we just ran out of time. Oh, we added it on to this other bill, or we allowed, someone else to put something in that was very similar to what you put in, and then they pass out the other person's legislation, and they don't pass out yours. Things happen where, people that would usually help you and even fundraise, or now they're being told, don't help that person. It comes in a variety of ways, and so it's very difficult. And because the public, I think, often isn't paying attention to a lot of the things that happen in Annapolis, because we're so close to DC that a lot of things what happens in DC overshadows.
Right.
And so there's a lot of people that can hide and a lot of misbehavior that happens. I had a bill which on the floor to show you how retaliation works. On the floor, when a bill reaches third reader, usually it's just passed. One time, and this wasn't dealing with harassment, but it was a way to put me in my place, I had a bill that every time it came up for third reader, a different senator stood up and said, I'd like to hold that bill. They don't have to give a reason. And I was texted and said, they're messing with your bill, Angela. They're not going to let your legislation pass. They did that all day until time ran out and the session ended and the legislation failed on third reader. And that happened in front of, it's public record. You can pull the votes. You can pull who did it. I won't name them because
Can you tell me a little bit about this bill?
Certainly, it was a very simple bill. It was a bill to revert name changes. Women who, and it wasn't just for women, but if you want to return to your maiden name after a divorce, especially if you're dealing with DV, there was a point where you had to file a whole onerous process. You had to put it in the newspaper, and so
domestic violence, just to be clear.
Yes, and so what my bill was, it was going to make name change more simple. You could just change it on a motion. You didn't have to publish it in the newspaper. You could just submit a motion saying, I'd like to return to my former name.
That seems very reasonable.
Very reasonable. It was, and the bill was voted out. People didn't have a problem with the bill. In 2016, the bill had went through, it was fine. It had gone through the House, it had gone through the Senate. Because I had stood up and stood against the House for an issue on domestic violence, to teach me a lesson, that bill reached the floor of the Senate and was killed. God. That's the way retaliation works in Annapolis. Now, if you were watching it, a lot of people saw that it was killed. They just thought, oh, we just ran out of time. Oh, they just kept special ordering the bill. But everyone in Annapolis understood that was teaching Angela a lesson. You don't step out of line.
Right. As a reporter looking from the outside, I wouldn't have known that this was some form of retaliation, that this was teaching you a lesson. I would have just assumed ran out of time. That's incredible.
Or that sometimes someone will say, well, I had a question on the bill. You didn't have a question, right? Yeah. The next year the bill sailed through, right? Because now I was back on my good behavior. That was the lesson learned. The bill went through. There were no questions. It was passed pretty early in session. And that's the way retaliation works.
Incredible.
And as I said, to be clear, because I don't want someone, that wasn't in retaliation for me reporting harassment, but it was just a way to illustrate this is how Annapolis works and how you can be retaliated in front of everyone, and yet you're not protected. So going back to my own experiences, having experienced that and understanding this is how it works, you're very much scared to report incidents.
Sure.
For me, it's, as simple as, the culture in Annapolis is very male dominated. It's, there's a lot of sexual jokes. There's a lot of, and there's this fine line that you have to walk because you don't want to be considered, too sensitive. There were times when I was ridiculed over the fact that I'm a single mom. There were, on the floor, and this is on the House floor where we're actually deciding legislation, where I was once called, oh, you're the baby mama legislator. In itself was not only, it was ridiculous, but it was also untrue. Because one of the reasons, and honestly, as a black woman, as a single mother operating, one of the reasons why I never take up child care or child support issues is because I didn't want to be framed that way. Mm-hmm. So it was also just like completely out of context. One time I was told, someone said, oh, well, I'm going to call you Badu. I'm going to call you Erykah Badu. And I said, well, what are you talking about? And this is on the floor. Men, women were sitting there. They heard. They said, because, you always make the brothers call Tyrone. You're always trying to get a brother put out. And legislators chuckled. There were men and women that heard. That time I actually did get an apology because I will admit it was a point in session where it didn't make me. It's one of the few times that I've actually reacted and I cried and I'm not, it was in part because I think it was an emotionally charged point in session. There's points in sessions where, just everything is going so fast. But that time the legislator, a senior member came to them and made them apologize to me because they saw that I was upset. So, you know, that was one of the few times that someone else did speak up for me, but many times it's just, you know, overlooked. Sometimes it's a joke and it's chuckled at. I've been physically grabbed, you know, where, you know, someone will say, you know, I've had someone say, you know, and has grabbed me. There's been times where I've gone up, you know, say there's colleagues talking, and, you know, someone will say, well, don't you see two men talking? And it's like, and you know, and it's, at some point it became so regular, like at one point in time when I would say that, if someone would say that to me, I would go, well, you know what, I don't, so I'm gonna proceed with my question. But that was par for the course.
Incredible.
You know, and that's, you know, that's not including, you know, having, you know, your behind grabbed, you know, having someone reference to, you know, your body parts. And to be honest, there have been other women legislators and women staffers who have told me stories that are much worse, of being kissed, of being touched forcibly, of being assaulted, like their private parts, like through their clothes or someone going up their skirt, of being, you know, grabbed, of all types of things that have happened to women down there. And to the point that most of them will never name the people that are there because they're still there. They're still very much in power, and there's no protection. And that's a fear, you know, and it's something that even when I first came forward, I didn't even share as much of the story as I share now because I was so fearful of the retaliation, of what they would do to me. And I remember someone saying to me, and someone asking the question, well, why won't you just name, why won't you just out the people that are doing this? And I said, one, because I don't think they'll stop, and I don't think they'll be punished. That's what the system has shown me. And two, like we talked about Anita Hill, we've talked about, you know, you look at the Monica Lewinskys, and the woman who was asking me who, you know, was someone who said, you know, I can make a difference. And I said, name me one woman who's outed a predator that has still been able to remain doing what they were doing, to still remain effective.
Right.
And she couldn't. I said, I advocate for victims. I passed laws in 2017. I had one of the highest passage rate for legislation in the House. I said, I can't stop the advocacy that I do and risk all of that because it's a greater good to out one or two people and their bad behavior when that may not even make a difference.
Right. That's that communal thinking that you were talking about.
Exactly, and that's the weight that we carry. That's the weight that I think a lot of, you know, staffers, you know, lobbyists, and even legislators that we carry. Yes, we know these men. Yes, we still have to work with them. Yes, we still have to figure out how to operate. But also at the end of the day, we would sacrifice our career.
Right.
And time after time again, what society has shown is the women are sacrificed, and the men, they may be punished if they are at all, but they get to completely keep going. And usually the woman is left as a casualty.
Right.
And when I look at the work that I still have to do in Annapolis, I can't risk that.
All right, so we just heard from Taya Graham on sexual harassment in Annapolis. Wow, that was a pretty heavy piece.
Yeah, it's a tough piece.
That's wild. So Taya's got another piece this week with Stephen Janis. She interviewed Sheldon Laskin, who's running for state senate here in Maryland, against Bobby Zirkin.
Yeah, the incumbent Bobby Zirkin was recently making headlines for supporting this crime bill in the state senate. He's the incumbent that Sheldon Laskin's running against. And Taya and Stephen actually interviewed him in this room in the radio studio. And yeah, he had some really interesting things to say about criminal justice reform, about the legalization of drugs. Yeah, check it out.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Stephen Janis. I'm a reporter with The Real News. Since The Real News headquarters is located in Baltimore, Maryland, we have a front row seat on what Democrats do when they think no one is looking. And instead of characterizing, I'll just recount some of the things that happened in our recent legislative session. Democrats passed tougher sentencing laws. They increased funding for policing. They cracked down on gangs, and they would not allow voters to weigh in on legalized pot. And they said a big no to safe spaces for heroin addicts to take their drugs in a place where they're safe and during one of the worst opioid crises in recent history. It's a far cry from the progressive bona fides that some Democrats like to tout. Of course, I'm not naive about Democrats, and they can be just as conservative as Republicans. After all, Baltimore is the former stomping ground of Martin O'Malley, who was the one who implemented zero-tolerance policing, which led to the illegal arrest of hundreds of thousands of African Americans, which is why the candidate that my reporting partner, Taya Graham, and I will be interviewing is so critical. He is the first challenger in nearly 12 years to Bobby Zirkin, who is the Democrat who chairs a powerful Judiciary Committee. Zirkin is a Baltimore County state senator who has been what many say is a roadblock to criminal justice reform over the past 12 or 15 years. His opponent, who's joining us today, is Sheldon Laskin, a lawyer and activist who promises to bring his history of progressive advocacy to the job. Mr. Laskin, thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
And thank you, Taya, for joining us.
It is my pleasure to be here.
So before we get to the interview, we're going to run a quick package of Taya's reporting on the Judiciary Committee and some of the problems with progressive reform in Annapolis right here.
This is Taya Graham reporting for the Real News Network in Annapolis, Maryland. If anyone was hoping that progressive reforms would win the day in this Democratic state, they needed to come to the last day of session in Annapolis, sign or die. From a bill that would stop the city from auctioning off houses over a past due water bill.
It's very discouraging, and the attempt is to mislead the public that something is being done in water and to actually set things back.
To a package of new laws that would impose mandatory sentences for the second possession of a handgun.
We have a choice to make. Do we want to go backwards with policies that haven't worked?
The Maryland legislature continued to bolster an agenda that advocates say is going in the wrong direction.
And so that in concert with these new mandatory minimums only reestablishes the status quo in terms of what we think about crime prevention in Baltimore.
Today, on the last day of the session, we went behind the scenes inside this empty Senate Judiciary Committee room where one of the key architects of the tough on crime measures, Democratic Senator Bobby Zirkin, presided over last-ditch efforts to pass the bill. After the session, the Real News asked Republican Governor Larry Hogan why he focused on get tough laws to battle crime in a city with one of the most corrupt police departments in the country.
In Baltimore, they were concerned about the emphasis on tougher sentences, the problems with the Baltimore Police Department, the problems with law enforcement in Baltimore. Why are you pushing for tougher sentences, given those problems? Do you have confidence in your criminal justice system?
Well, it's two different issues. I mean, certainly there's corruption in the Baltimore City Police Department that we have to root out, and that's one issue.
A philosophy that revealed the stark divisions between the people who want reform and the leaders who make the final decisions.
So, Mr. Laskin, just for people who aren't familiar with you, why do you think you're qualified to be the state senator to replace Bobby Zirkin? What makes you qualified?
Well, first of all, I am an attorney. I've been an attorney for over 40 years. I have had a variety of positions as an attorney. I started out representing migrant and seasonal farm workers in rural Florida. I've handled employment discrimination cases. I won an employment discrimination case in the U.S. Supreme Court. I was an assistant Maryland Attorney General for 8.5 years under Joe Curran. And more recently, I've worked for a state government organization of state revenue departments and attorneys general, working on tax legislation, model tax legislation for a number of states. I've also been an activist my entire life. I became politically active in the Eugene McCarthy campaign in 1968, and I've stayed active in progressive causes throughout my life. And I think this background gives me a rather rich, diverse background from which to become a Maryland state senator.
Now, I was curious. Senator Zirkin has run unopposed, and the last time he was opposed, he still won by 70%. What makes you feel that you have a realistic chance of beating Bobby Zirkin?
Well, first of all, the district has become more diverse. It's now about 25% minority.
African American, Latino, a lot of immigrants in the Owings Mills, Newtown area. So that is a factor. That community definitely supports progressive legislation and should support a progressive legislator. Also, the very fact that he ran unopposed, if there's only one name on the ballot, you've got two choices. You vote for the name or you don't vote.
Right.
And that will have an effect of inflating the numbers. From what we can tell, and it's not scientific, we haven't done scientific polling, there's a great deal of dissatisfaction in the district as to how the district has been represented in Annapolis these past dozen years. A sense that he's not really representing the values of the district when he blocks progressive legislation or sponsors regressive legislation like the Omnibus Crime Bill.
Well, one of the issues that's been big in Annapolis for reform advocates is, including a civilian on internal police trial boards. So do you support that
Yes.
will you support that if you're elected?
Yeah, I just went to the Community Monitoring Task Force meeting last night, and that subject was discussed at some length. Definitely. I mean, the police work for us, not the other way around. And they should be responsible to their employer being the people who pay their salary. And it's only just and proper that civilians have a role in reviewing police misconduct. It's the only way that the public will be satisfied with the results of that investigation. If civilians have a meaningful role to play in the process and a police officer or officers are exonerated, then the public is more likely to accept that as being valid.
Nataya and I, we have researched Bobby Zirkin's record. He's taken a lot of money from the FOP, which is the police union.
Yes.
Are you going to take money from the FOP?
I'm not taking money from the FOP. I'm not taking money from bail bondsmen. He also gets a lot of money from bail bondsmen.
I was going to ask you about that.
Or real estate developers. In fact, I'm not taking money from any special interest.
Yeah.
My money is entirely from average people, small contributions, and no corporate money, as far as I can tell, from anyone.
Now, if you're willing to not take any money from the bail bonds industry, are you also willing to support ending cash bail?
Yes, a cash bail does not serve a positive purpose in the criminal justice system. All it means is that poor people who can't afford bail just sit there and rot until their case is heard or dismissed, which happens frequently.
True.
And if someone has money, they're released even if they are a threat to the community because they can make bail. All it is, it's a profit-making enterprise that enriches bail bondsmen and the insurance companies that back them up. Bail bondsmen can actually imprison people for debt. Debt to them, not debt to the court system.
That's a good point.
That's absolutely unacceptable in the 21st century.
So let me ask you a question here. You're representing Baltimore County. Is that going to be difficult for you to sort of reconcile those two things? Because technically you're not really representing the city, and yet we're asking you about city issues.
Right.
How are you going
to? The current incumbent, of course, as chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, passes on a lot of legislation or refuses to pass on a lot of legislation that directly impacts the city. This is a region. When I first moved into the county, I was in a combined district, city-county. I don't think they ever should have ended that.
Yeah.
Because when you have a combined district, then the county has county voters have more of a stake in more direct stake in what's going on in the city. But county voters benefit from the amenities of the city. Many of them, if not most of them, work in the city, and county voters and residents, I don't think, want to turn their backs on what's going on in the city. And inevitably, what happens in Baltimore City doesn't stay in Baltimore City. It spills over the line. And I think it's in the interest of county residents, particularly people like me. I live very close to the city line. I bicycle, and most of my standard bike route is actually in the city, just over the line. We have a stake in what happens in the city.
Now, I was wondering, I just finished an interview with Brittany Oliver, who's the director of Not Without Black Women, and I also spoke with Delegate Angela Angel, and they worked very hard to pass legislation to help end sexual harassment in Annapolis. Delegate Angel and others testified to state senators, delegates, staffers, interns experiencing mistreatment and sexual harassment. I wanted to know what you're willing to do to commit to ending sexual harassment in Annapolis.
Right. Well, one of my early jobs was at the EEOC. So I handled sex discrimination cases as well as race and age including sexual harassment. And you're never going to have a work environment where decisions are made entirely on merit as long as you have a work environment that allows for sexual harassment of interns and of legislators.
And of legislators, yes.
And it's in order to instill trust in the people with whom you work, you have to be confident that if there is an incident of sexual harassment, it will be addressed appropriately with, if sanctions are warranted, appropriate sanctions imposed. And we still have an old boy network in Annapolis, more so in the Senate than in the House, but still throughout the General Assembly, and that has to change. I don't have to tell you, the leadership of the Senate has been there forever.
Very true.
And reflect the values of a much earlier time, and things have changed, and things have to change in the General Assembly.
True.
One thing that's really interesting about your candidacy that kind of struck me is that Baltimore County is kind of conservative.
Yes.
But you're really running on a pretty straight progressive platform. What kind of challenges does that pose for you in the county?
Well, we do think that within specifically my district, the 11th district, there is a strong streak of progressivism reflected in some of the synagogues, my synagogue, at least one other synagogue, two large synagogues in the district. And there's also, if I have to say, a great deal of dissatisfaction with Senator Zirkin, even among people who might not call themselves
What do you think there's a dissatisfaction? What are people telling you that they're dissatisfied about Zirkin?
Well, I don't want to go into a great deal of Bobby bashing, but
I understand.
He has been there a very long time, and he has taken positions that have aroused opposition, and also it's the way he treats people. Disrespectfully.
In fact, the Maryland Democratic Party itself in some ways is very conservative. For example, the omnibus crime bill that you mentioned, initially there was supposed to be money there for Safe Streets, which is a community-based violence reduction initiative, but they added in mandatory minimum sentences to it. So what kind of chance for progressive reform are you seeing?
Right. Well, yeah, the bill as it came out, I analogize it to, on the one hand, here's $200 million for tobacco cessation, and on the other hand, here's $200 million to subsidize the growing of tobacco. It's doomed to failure. A lot of that came out of fear and fear-mongering and looking towards the election. And that's part of politics. It's the lousy part of politics. But I think in some cases, their ultimate votes did not reflect how they truly felt. And hopefully this election will show that it is possible to take a principled position on crime and come out okay.
Well, let me give you another example of progressive legislation. Delegate Morheim has been trying to pass a bill for safe consumption spaces, which allows people who use drugs to have a safe place, to have someone there who can administer naloxone, the overdose, life-saving medication, provide people with clean equipment to use their drugs. And this bill has failed again, despite the fact we're in one of the worst opioid crises in the history of this country. And yet this bill keeps on being pushed back.
Right. Frankly, the use of drugs, regardless of what the drug is, should be legal, because that's how you encourage people to get into treatment, and that's how you can monitor their treatment so that the treatment is safe and hopefully get them to wean off their drug dependency. As long as we keep failing to pass legislation that allows for safe spaces and decriminalizes the usage, you're going to have street-level crime, which will mean violence. You're never going to get a handle on that. You can put people away for life. There's always going to be another person on the street to take their place, and the problem doesn't go away. It gets worse.
True.
These are health problems. Kurt Schmoke said 20-some-odd years ago.
I think it was like 30 years.
Now it's 30 years ago.
Yeah, it was like in the late 80s.
Yeah, you're dating me. He said this is a public health problem.
Yes.
That's what it is, and we still don't treat it seriously as a public health problem. Every once in a while we give lip service to it. But as long as we criminalize it, we're not going to incarcerate our way out of the drug problem. Where opioids specifically are concerned, as I think a lot of the blame lies with pharmaceutical company salesmen.
Yes.
I had a wisdom tooth removed a couple of years ago. And the surgeon, without even asking me, just wrote a prescription for an opioid. I didn't fill it. I just took a couple of Tylenol. I mean, a wisdom tooth? And you need an opioid. My wife had brain surgery, and they wrote a prescription for an opioid. She took Tylenol. Wow. Brain surgery. It is overprescribed. That is where the problem came from. And there needs to be some serious discipline imposed, both on pharmaceutical salesmen who obviously profit from it, and the physicians who share in those profits.
So one of the other things that failed in Annapolis was a bill that would have allowed voters to vote on whether or not to legalize marijuana. Would you support a referendum for voters to have their say on whether marijuana should be legalized?
Yes.
Okay.
And
I figured you did. I mean,
I think it would pass. You talk about progressivism. I think a lot of people who don't consider themselves progressive would vote for it. Civil libertarians who are otherwise fairly right-wing feel it's nobody's business but my own. If I can drink, if I can smoke cigarettes, why can't I legally?
And we did get the
marijuana?
opportunity to vote on gambling. I don't know why we can't vote on marijuana.
Right.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of politics comes down to money. Zirkin has access to bail bonds, police unions. You don't have that access. Can you raise enough money to be competitive?
One of the insidious
how much have you raised, if you want to talk about it?
Okay. One of the insidious effects of big money in politics is that people assume that because a candidate or an incumbent has a war chest of $300,000 to $500,000, then that's what's needed to win the election. And it isn't. Most of these large war chests don't go to paying for the cost of the campaign. They go, number one, to deter people from running against them, which is one reason Senator Zirkin has not had an opponent in 12 years. And the other, frankly, so that they can give part of that money to the leadership in the General Assembly to curry favor and get coveted positions. To your specific question about how much money we've raised, we think we can do this campaign for something like $65,000, a very credible campaign. I only opened the account on Valentine's Day. We are over $30,000, and we expect to be over $40,000 this week.
Wow!
So we're on course for getting that $60 to $65. The money. What is very gratifying is that the money has been coming in at a very steady rate.
Is this small donations? What kind of donors are you seeing? Or
small donations? I mean, there have been some that have been four figures. I'll be honest with you. There have been a few four-figure donations. But for the most part, smaller than that.
Interesting.
Just curious, and this is slightly off topic. In relation to corruption in the Senate, we saw Senator Nathaniel Oakes have ethical conflicts, corruption, accepting money that perhaps allegedly accepting money that perhaps he shouldn't have.
No, he's pled guilty.
He has pled guilty.
He pled guilty.
Okay, so we know for sure that he.
But it looks like he's still going to be on the ballot.
Yes,
and that's
right.
one.
He said he was willing to remove his name.
Yeah, he just had to remove himself from the voter rolls, and now he can be removed as a candidate.
Right.
Because as long as he's registered voter, they couldn't remove him for some reason.
But that's a law that should be changed. Right now, you're on the ballot until sentencing, which is stupid. Once you're convicted, it shouldn't matter what the sentence is. You should be ineligible to be on the ballot from the date that you're sentenced. It's nice that he's decided that he's going to remove himself from the voter rolls, but what if he hadn't done that?
Right.
You'd have this ridiculous situation where in theory he could win the election.
He could still win it.
He could win the election but never be seated because a month later, once he was sentenced, he would be ineligible to serve in the Senate.
Well, that's what I was curious
crazy.
about. Like, how, do you think there should be any changes in the way the Senate handles, politicians being, essentially convicted of corruption or even accused of corruption?
We saw him down there. He was walking around like he was still
right.
Senator.
And my understanding, because he was appointed to that position, he wasn't elected to that position, the Senate did have more freedom to remove him than if he had been elected.
Okay.
There is an argument if the voters have elected a senator, then that should not lightly be overturned in the absence of a conviction.
Right.
I understand that. But he wasn't elected by the voters. And my understanding is for an appointed senator, had Senator Miller truly wished to have him removed, there was a way to do that and have someone else appointed in his place.
Well, speaking of that, you talked about entrenched leadership. Would you, if you were elected, would you support a change in the leadership of the Senate, someone replacing Mike Miller?
Yeah, I went to the Take a Hike Mike rally.
And is that what it's called?
Yes. And as I said, I've been endorsed by SEIU, and that's one of their major goals is a change in Senate leadership. Senator Zirkin reflects the leadership. He's part of the leadership. He's a problem, but he's not the only problem in Annapolis. It comes from the top.
Yeah. No, I mean, Miller's been around longer than anyone in the country, right? In terms of time. That's going to be a big challenge to try
to uproot.
Yeah. Well, I think I guess, when is the primary again? Just
June 26th. The primary is June 26th for voters in the 11th district.
Okay. Well, I think all of us are going to be watching your election pretty closely. We have had a lot of experience in Annapolis covering the Judicial Proceedings Committee, and it is going to be interesting to see how the voters in your district react.
It'll be interesting to see if those changes in demographics that you mentioned, the fact that it's more diverse now, is going to support you and the progressive policies that you have proposed.
Well, Mr. Laskin, good luck, and thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we can have you back at some point, to talk, update us, see how the election goes, and just to let...
There is a forum where we are both invited.
Is he going to go?
I don't know.
Okay.
We'll see.
All right, well anyway.
He's invited here at the Real News, and so are you, Mr. Laskin, and hopefully we can have a productive conversation.
So you've just been listening to Sheldon Laskin, who is a candidate for Senate against Senator Bobby Zirkin in Baltimore County. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Laskin.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Laskin.
And thank you, Taya. And this is the Real News, and this is Stephen Janis, and peace out.
All right, that's going to be an interesting race to watch. I think all of these Maryland races are going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, for sure. Stay tuned in the coming weeks. We'll be following all these races. The interesting ones and the not so interesting ones.
So this last piece, Jezel Noor did about Johns Hopkins nurses. There's a union campaign going on, but there's also an anti-union campaign that Hopkins has started. This piece, I think, hits particularly home for me because, having been a former union organizer, political organizer for the union that currently represents the service workers at Johns Hopkins back in 2014, there was a big fight. We went on strike. And then there's always been this history at Hopkins of blocking out the union. Even when our executive producers here, Eddie Conway, talks about, before he spent 44 years in jail as a political prisoner, he was at Hopkins, you know what I mean, working on the union battle. So all of these years later, Hopkins is still very adamant about, not giving workers the power to, negotiate their own contracts and represent themselves. So there's the nurses there. You and Jezel actually went to Philly and talked to some actual unionized nurses.
Yeah, we talked to some nurses who have been unionized for many, many years. And yeah, we actually, not to give away too much, but we found some, places that basically anti-union nurses, possibly also management, or were talking online about the reasons that they didn't want a union. And we brought some of those issues that they had with people who had been unionized, and we're kind of like, these folks think that a union would be bad for patient care. Would they be bad for patient care? And of course, the answer from them was no. So yeah, this piece we hope can shed some light on the anti-union campaign going on over at Hopkins, and
yeah, it's a beautiful piece, man. Let's check it out.
Shortly after the uprising and the aftermath of the death of Freddie Gray, Johns Hopkins made a promise to invest in the community and right the social and economic ills that fueled the protests. In light of those promises, many are following how the state's largest employer responds to its own employees that are demanding change. As nurses at the world-renowned Johns Hopkins Hospital have sought to unionize, instead of embracing the requests from critical care workers for fair pay and better working conditions, the multi-billion-dollar institution has played hardball, hiring a high-profile union-busting firm, Littler Mendelsohn, to lead an effort against them. The Real News has learned The Real News also obtained a letter nurses delivered to management, demanding an end to a, quote, anti-union campaign, alleging intimidation and an infringement on the rights of the nurses to form a union. In response, Hopkins sent us a statement that reads the hospital, quote, has deep respect for the nurses and their rights as employees to support or oppose a union. The nurses who went public with their campaign last month cited low pay and a low nurse-to-patient ratio in Hopkins facilities, which nurses say endangers their patients. Studies have found unionized nurses receive higher pay and are responsible for fewer patients than their non-union counterparts. Not all nurses support the union effort. A website as well as Facebook group with over 200 members oppose the union. They didn't respond to interview requests for this story. Neither did those seeking to unionize with the country's biggest nurses union, National Nurses United. Their unwillingness to talk is perhaps a reflection of the power of the sprawling institution that dominates both politics and the landscape of Baltimore. So to actually talk to nurses who have fought the same battle and to understand what's at stake, we had to travel to Philadelphia. In 2010, The Real News interviewed nurses at Temple University Hospital, who had just completed a month-long strike for better pay and working conditions.
Hospital administration was very intent on breaking up the union.
Today, union nurses at Temple make far more than their counterparts at Johns Hopkins. While factoring in Philadelphia's higher cost of living, 3 Hopkins nurses we spoke to currently make between 12 and 20% less than their counterparts at Temple. After a contractually mandated October wage increase, that number jumps to 16 to 23%.
The differences are black and white. I will never work in a non-union hospital.
Temple nurses told us that even more important than the increased pay is the power unionized nurses have to advocate for their patients.
Decisions are made in the ivory tower that had nothing to do with the bedside. And as union nurses, we're able to collectively lend our voice to the situations that are most important to our patients.
We also wanted to understand why some nurses might oppose joining a union. We found a Facebook group called Keep JHH Union Free. They didn't respond to interview requests, so we brought some of their concerns to Sue Swift, who has worked at St. Christopher's Hospital for Children for over 3 decades. 2 years ago, she helped lead a successful union effort there and now serves as the president of her local. On the anti-union Facebook page, one post is particularly striking. A meme posted on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King that quotes him to stress the importance of unity instead of joining a union.
Well, we know that he was there for to support union workers the day that he was killed, right? And Martin Luther King said this a lot. Nobody in power is just going to hand you things. Now that we have a collective bargaining unit, we now have power. We are the voice for our patients.
Many posts in the group argue the union will be divisive, will act as a third party, or that concerns can be addressed without a union.
We didn't get a union because we didn't like nursing. We got a union so we could have a voice. And it wasn't against our managers, it was for us. It was just for us to have a voice.
We'll keep following the story, so stay tuned at therealnews.com. If you're a Hopkins nurse and want to be interviewed in a follow-up, please send an email to contact@therealnews.com. In Baltimore, this is Jessel Noor.
All right, you just heard Jessel Noor, the piece on the Hopkins nurses who are trying to unionize at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And that's all we've got for today. We're going to close it out with something kind of special, though.
Yeah.
This is something that we're using that Stephanie Mavronis and Mark Gunnery did for the Mark Steiner Show from the Center for Emerging Media 3 years ago during the Baltimore uprising. They went to a local theater here, Center Stage, where they were doing a production of Marley, a show about Bob Marley. And the cast of that show actually marched over to Penn North singing the songs from the show, which is very powerful. Check out the video, too.
Yeah, it's awesome. That was a really special moment, too, when that actually happened. So thanks for watching, tuning in. You can check all of this stuff out on therealnews.com. Stay tuned. We'll be doing more, right?
Yeah, we'll be back next week.
Next week.
One love. One love. Let's get together and feel alright. One love, one heart. Give thanks and praise to the Lord.